This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Welcome to this event. This is the public part of the first meeting of a new initiative in the School of Advanced Study called the Human Mind Project. And when I say this is the public part, we've already had a 3-hour workshop in which several of the members of the steering committee of this new activity gave talks, and we considered a number of issues from many different disciplines relating to what it is we mean by the mind and how best we might understand it, particularly through work between academics, between researchers working in different disciplines. And even, dare I say it, in CP Snow territory between the arts and the sciences. The Human Mind Project, the name shamelessly echoes much grander affairs, at least grander in terms of cost. The Human Genome Project, of course, the $3 billion project in which the Wellcome Trust played a large part, largely done in the United States through NIH, the effort to define the sequence of the human genome, which captured an interesting concept that it might be possible to perform a piece of science or technology definitively and completely, as the name omics implies. Earlier this year, a project that claimed to be similar, called the Human Brain Project, was launched in Europe, and a somewhat related project in the United States called interestingly, the acronym is BRAIN, about new technologies for exploring the brain. And the Human Brain Project claims to be doing an omics on the brain. The idea is to define, as it were, comprehensively the structure and organization of the brain, one of the objectives being to simulate the human brain and all of its capacities computationally. The blurb from their website says that it will be catalyzing a global collaborative effort to understand the human brain and its diseases, and ultimately to emulate its computational capabilities. It does have, an element of overreach and hype that in just a few years scientists would even understand the structure of the brain with its 10 to the 15 connections, let alone define how that structure carried out the actions of the human brain. And it occurred to some of us here that really what is needed for this very important project to go forward, what's more important really than understanding how we work as human beings, was to set the amazing technologies of brain research in the context of what 2,500 years of scholarship from the humanities and the arts has told us about the capacities of the human mind. The creativity, the culture, the invention, the collaboration, cooperation between people, the development of societies and cities and agriculture, and all of those amazing things that we've done. And interestingly, of course, a lot of the things that we've done very rapidly and explosively in the last few hundred years, like inventing science, for instance, going to the moon and all that stuff, clearly has been done without any substantial change in our genes. So biologists tend to think that there's a very tight relationship between what animals can do and their genetic makeup, and it's all Darwinism, that's what it's all about. But there's a curious mismatch in the case of human beings, because they have this thing called cultural evolution. Now, I say firmly where I stand on this issue, and I suspect that most of the people who are going to be associated with this project would agree that, in principle, we don't have anything else to explain our behavior than our brains, our senses and our brains and our capacities to move and talk. In other words, there's no intrinsic magic in the system. It might be impossible ever to understand it completely. I would guess actually it is impossible ever to understand it completely. But underpinning the investigation is what one might call physicalism, the idea that there must be causal physical explanations for everything we do. So the idea of the Human Mind Project is to gather an amazing group of scholars, and what surprised me in asking people if they wanted to play a part in this has been how enthusiastic, really amazing experts from a huge range of disciplines have been, and how many people have said, this is timely, this is just the moment to do it, because of the expansion of the brain sciences on the one hand, but the growing opportunities for interaction and collaboration within the humanities as well. So the idea is to really to set the context very clearly for our scientists and friends and colleagues. If they intend to give an account of human behavior, we have to give an account of what is their task, to set it in the context of the achievements of the arts and the humanities. To approach this topic in the future is certainly going to require interdisciplinarity, and there are all kinds of problems with people working across disciplinary boundaries, even within the humanities or within the sciences, let alone between the sciences and the arts and humanities, but that will certainly be needed. So this event is simply to showcase the beginnings of discussion. I think will probably continue over a year or more before we start to produce reports and views on what the grand challenges and opportunities are in this area. And the speakers, just 4 of a group already of 30 scholars who've agreed to join this effort, represent, I think you'll agree when you hear about them, not only the range of disciplines represented in these efforts, but individually the importance of interdisciplinarity. So starting first with Deirdre Wilson at the far end, who is Emeritus Professor of Linguistics at University College, whose work has straddled language, communication, cognitive science, the importance of semantics and meaning. Robin Dunbar, who is an evolutionary psychologist, but whose work stretches to anthropology and social science and cognitive neuroscience. Nikki Clayton from Cambridge, who is a professor of comparative cognition, best known for her work on bird brains. And it turns out, as I'm sure she'll tell us in a moment, that birds are very clever, which raises interesting questions because they have small brains, but they can do some of the things we think we need large brains to do, but is now increasingly interested in human infant development, and also happens to be scientist in residence for Ballet Rambert. And finally, Vittorio Gallese, who is medical originally. He's a neurophysiologist. He was one of the discoverers of what are called mirror neurons. Perhaps he'll tell us about them, which has generally been greeted as a hugely significant discovery in neuroscience. These are neurons, nerve cells in the brain of monkeys, but very good evidence we have them too, which appear to be playing a part in planning our actions, but which also respond and react when the animal, or we, see other people carrying out the same actions. There's a relationship between someone else carrying out a movement and our own intention to carry out the movement, which some people have suggested is a kind of link between ourselves and other people's minds. So, there we are. This is our very distinguished panel. I've just asked them to speak, each of them to speak for a few minutes each, about their view of this challenge of understanding the mind, if you like, and then maybe a little bit of repartee between them, and I'll open it up then for discussion with the audience. So, first of all then, Deidre, tell us about the mind.
So first I wanted to say how pleased I was to receive an invitation to participate in this project. Interdisciplinary work of the type that we're contemplating is particularly needed in the topic I work on, which is human communication. Human communication is one of the most distinctive features, and in particular the way they communicate with language is, I think, unique. In the last 20 or 30 years, the old models of communication that have worked quite well for animal communication have been shown to be increasingly inadequate to deal with human communication and human linguistic communication in particular. So one of the most exciting challenges of the Human Mind Project is to develop new models that will work for human linguistic communication. And here I think interdisciplinary work is really needed from across the whole spectrum of the humanities and the cognitive sciences. And I'm going to try and explain that in the next few minutes. So there's a very well entrenched model of communication, the code model, which says communication takes place in the following way. It involves the use of codes. The communicator has a certain message to convey, encodes that message into an observable signal, which is then decoded by the receiver at the other end. This probably does work quite well for animal communication, but it's increasingly become obvious in the last 20 or 30 years that it fails abysmally for human communication. So the idea of a code model of communication, of human linguistic communication, would then be that we have certain thoughts we want to convey, we encode those thoughts into sentences, we utter those sentences, the sentences are decoded by the hearer at the other end, and that's how communication takes place. Now, as I said, although this model probably does work quite well for animals, it doesn't work at all for humans because there's a huge gap between the sort of meanings that sentences encode and the sort of meanings that speakers, human speakers, communicate by uttering those sentences in context. You just take a very simple sentence like, he finished the paper. Very, very short sentence. There's an indefinite range of possible meanings that are compatible with the meaning of that sentence that the speaker might want to convey. He could be used to refer to any male human. A paper could be a newspaper, a journal, wallpaper, an article, waste paper for shredding, and so on. Furthermore, the action of finishing requires something to be done to the paper. And depending on what type of paper it is, different things will be done. Reading the newspaper, writing the journal article, shredding the waste paper, copy editing. There's a range of possible actions that the speaker might intend just using that sentence. Furthermore, there's lots of possibilities for not only for ambiguity, but for loose speech, for metaphorical speech, for ironical speech. The speaker might be implicitly criticizing or congratulating the person who'd carried out the action. And so there's a whole range of things that a speaker can communicate by uttering that sentence that aren't encoded in the meaning of that sentence. So what's interesting about the alternative models of communication that have been being developed over the past 20 years is that they do draw on inspiration from both the humanities and the cognitive sciences. The key idea came from a philosopher, Paul Grice, who argued that speakers' meanings were complex, nested layers of intentions. So understanding an utterance is reading the intentions of the speaker who was uttering that sentence. They're not just simple intentions, though. They're not just an intention to induce a belief or attitude in the audience. They're also an intention to have that basic intention recognized. So there's a highly complex mental state underlying even the utterance of a simple sentence like, he finished the paper. So the idea is then that understanding an utterance of a sentence is an exercise in mind reading, is an exercise in attributing mental states, complex mental states, to speakers. And of course, there have been huge strides in the cognitive sciences in the last 20 or 30 years in understanding how mind reading works. It's not a matter of decoding observable behavior. It's a matter of inferring the mental states behind an observable piece of behavior. And so looking at human communication is going to enable us to understand how these very complex non-demonstrative inference processes go on. Furthermore, we know they happen successfully. They happen very fast. And studying linguistic communication then can give us a good window into the way these complex non-demonstrative inference processes work. However, cognitive sciences have stopped at a certain point. They've stopped with the assumption that comprehension is simply a matter of mind reading. And the basic idea among most people that I've read in the cognitive sciences on human comprehension is indeed, well, it's just a matter of reading the intentions behind a piece of behavior as we would reading the intentions behind someone walking towards a fridge door and opening it. But there's now increasing evidence that that assumption is false, and that there's something special about the type of inference process that goes on in understanding human communication. In the first place, as Grice pointed out, speakers' meanings are very complex mental states. They're not simple intentions, they're sets of layered intentions, and we might expect there to be special purpose abilities needed to understand those utterances. In the second place, it's been increasingly obvious from developmental psychology that children are extremely sensitive to the presence of speakers' intentions, of communicative acts addressed to them. They orient to them differently, they process them differently, they read more into them. And this suggests again that there's a special purpose ability innately endowed, at least to some extent, which governs human communication, but not human intention reading in general. So Dan Sperber and I have been arguing for the last few years, in fact, that there is a special purpose dedicated comprehension module that works for human communication and not for anything else. And then just back to the humanities. Because what's happened in the humanities in the last 20 years or so is an increasing understanding of the complexity of speakers' meanings. In linguistics, philosophy, and literary studies, we're aware of the differences, for example, between communicating something verbally and non-verbally, explicitly or implicitly, literally, loosely, metaphorically, hyperbolically, ironically, and so on. All of these have an effect on communication. There are stylistic and poetic effects to deal with. So what the humanities can do is give us a deeper understanding of the very complex speakers' meanings that get communicated and that the cognitive sciences can help us to study. So this seems to me a very exciting project to be carried out over the next few years by proper interdisciplinary collaboration. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Robin Dunbar.
Okay, well, I'll start from the rather everyday observation that humans live in very big groups, as we're all familiar. We live in these enormous conurbations, and dare I mention it, even political units like the EU, for the moment. And the key problem we have really is how we engineer cohesion in those groups. That I see as the really big challenge that we've spent the last 10,000 years since the Neolithic settlement, when people first started really living in villages, trying to solve, and solving with some success, but obviously not perfectly. But it transpires that at the level of the individual, our ability to handle large social groups really is a reflection of our mentalizing competences. And this goes back to Grice, who was mentioned but a moment ago. But here in this context, I don't mean by mentalizing abilities just what everybody thinks of in terms of mentalizing or mind reading, which is usually theory of mind. My view is that's kids' stuff. Anybody can do that. Great apes can probably just about do it. It's what adults can aspire to do, and it's certainly from our data and many replications on this, the normal adult competences are something in the order of fifth order intentionality, where mind, conventional theory of mind is second order. That's what 5-year-old kids master, as it were. But we develop these progressively, it seems, these much higher orders as you go through the early stages of childhood. What seems to be important about that, well, now let me say, I am of the view, and I remain firmly of the view, that we have not the foggiest idea what this stuff is. I actually think it's probably an emergent property, and what we're measuring when we measure higher orders of intentionality in people is really some scale of their cognitive competences, but we really don't know what that is, and I'm kind of not too fussed. I certainly don't think it's modular. It's very much an emergent property, but it is measuring something about what people can handle in terms of mental states of other individuals. Now, it seems to me that becomes very important in the context of art, generically, where these two issues come together, because it's clear that one of the key things that we use in creating social cohesion on the large scale is common forms of culture, basically. We share the same worldview, we share the same interests, we have the same sense of humor, we have a common history, we have a common storytelling corpus that we all know and love and recognize. All these things are markers. Even, dare I say it, the familiar dances that we do on Saturday night or whatever it is, all these things are part of the things that create this sense of social bonding. And it seems to me that mentalizing comes in two ways here, not only in terms of understanding the individuals who belong to your corpus, but it becomes absolutely critical in allowing you to understand the deeper social meanings of these kinds of art, and particularly I think in terms of visual art on the one hand, but also things like storytelling, or indeed the meaning of dances, for example. I don't think you can do it, or at least this was our hunch, that you can't do that without the cognitive competencies that these high orders of mentalizing allow you to do. In that sense, it's I'm kind of not very sympathetic to the idea as it's a kind of module just for mind reading, but rather it is something that allows us to do very deep reflective thinking and allows us to step back from the world as we see it. The difference between us and almost all the other animals, even including great apes, is that they have their noses thrust up against the grindstone of reality, and they can't step back from it enough in order to be able to reflect on how the world is and whether it could have been otherwise or why it has to be the way it is, which obviously makes science possible. It's also what makes storytelling possible. You can't tell a story about fictional characters if you can't step back from that. Now, one of my side interests has actually been in the humanities. We have a project that's sort of unrelated to this on history, although it's about Viking sagas. It's about the Icelandic sagas is what we use. The other area is particularly storytelling for me. We have a couple of projects running now, which I'll just mention briefly. Both of these are unpublished, but these are such nice results because they illustrate the role of mentalizing in this context. One of them is the way Shakespeare actually writes his plays. He seems to be incredibly conscious of the fact that his audience can, on the whole, on average, only cope with fifth-order intentionality, and they have to sacrifice one of those orders for their own mind states. So his structure of scenes almost never has more than 4 speaking parts. And what's really nice about it is if the action on the stage, the characters are handling the mind state of somebody off stage, he only has 3 speaking parts. So he's keeping that rule very carefully. If they're talking about facts off stage, or they're talking about somebody's mind state on the stage, then he has 4 speaking parts in it. So he's kind of managing the structure of scene by scene, the structure of his plays, to pay very careful attention to the load he's putting on the audience. It's incredibly subtle. It turns out we do exactly the same in conversations. You can see exactly the same modulation, as it were, of discussions in live conversations. Well, that's the kind of average picture, if you like, but there's a surprising amount of variability between individuals in these mentalizing competencies at that age. I won't say what the sort of normative range is, but it's probably quite wide. And it occurred to us that might affect people's appreciation of storytelling in general, literature in particular. So we've just run a study, which we were looking at the data this very morning, in which we not only rated people's mentalizing competences, so we have where they sit on that, but also had them look at, read, and rate their own appreciation and enjoyment of the quality of those stories. There were several different kinds of stories. There were kind of romantic interest stories and sort of pseudo-le carré espionage stories. And they were of different complexity and different mind-reading demands on the reader as well. So they were also linguistically complex or simple, and they were mentalizingly complex or simple, and then we know how to rate that against the individual. So the question we were asking is, do people who have higher mentalizing competencies above 5th order, remember 5th order is the average for the population, enjoy more complex stories and get more out of them? And it turns out they do. There's a very nice correlation between subjects' mentalizing abilities and their appreciation of more demanding literature. So my pitch to you, just to sum up, is this is the difference between Jeffrey Archer and Shakespeare. Jeffrey Archer is a humdrum, normal individual like the rest of us who can manage 5th order intentionality. And because he has to sacrifice 1 order of intentionality for himself, he can only write stories that involve 3 mind states. Good writers, exceptional writers who have staying power, like Shakespeare, can operate at a much, much higher level and write a story, because they can work at 6th order maybe and above. They're sacrificing the 6th order for themselves, as it were. They're able to take the audience to their cognitive limits, and that's why they can extract real emotional depth out of a story from the audience or from the reader, if it's a novelist. Whereas a jobbing airport novelist, did I say Jeffrey Archer? how could I? Can only aspire to telling a very simple narrative. And so, but it seems to me there's loads of interesting questions we can ask at the cognitive level, which nobody's really asked before, I think, about the interface between the storyteller, the composer, the dramatist, if you like, on the one hand, the audience through which all this is being filtered, and the complexity of the art form, whatever art form it is, most obvious in the case of storytelling, in terms of how well that winds up, if you like, the excitement of the reader, and then in the sense how important that is in terms of creating this one bundle of knowledge, this cultural bundle of knowledge that a community shares. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. And Nikki Clayton.
Well, it's a real privilege and pleasure to be here, and I'm very excited about this project. As Colin mentioned, I'm Professor of Comparative Cognition, and comparative I want to stress because I'm interested in many animals, including human beings. What's so special about the human mind? Well, for me, the answer is obvious. It's language. No other animal can read and write, full stop. Now, many people assume, though, that thinking is uniquely human as well. But I want to argue that we humans share some of our cognitive abilities, our thought processes, with other animals, despite their lack of language. So I suppose I'm trying to push the boundaries of the human uniqueness of cognition. So I want to make two provocative claims. The first is that some non-human animals are capable of imagination, of thinking about things that aren't in the here and now, to think about other minds and other times. And the second provocative claim is that some of the best evidence comes not from our closest relatives, the primates, but in fact from much more distantly related feathered cousins, those beady-eyed crows. Now, members of the crow or corvid family, which includes the ravens and jays and magpies, are bona fide members of the clever club. Like other big-brained and highly social animals, such as chimpanzees and dolphins, these birds use and make tools. They show creative problem-solving, and they pass the mirror test, which is hailed by some as a marker of self-recognition. Corvids also show sophisticated social smarts and coordinated teamwork. My own personal favourite is the synchronous movements that you see a pair-bonded male and female rook make, in which they literally move in synchrony. It's akin, for me, as a dancer, to Argentine tango, where you have a leader and a follower. And in fact, after the first or second movement, the signals are so complex that the leader is able to signal the intention to move, such that both leader and follower, or male and female rook, move together. Now, although the brains of birds are very different, they're organised in a nucleated format, which is a bit more like a fruit cake than the mammalian sort of standard six-layered Sachertorte or Austrian-German cake model. Recent neuroanatomical studies have revealed that both the connectivity and the functional circuitry of the bird brain is far more similar to ours than previously thought. So birdsong, for example, has turned out to be a really good model for various aspects of human speech. But what of their powers of imagination? Well, most of these birds, these crows I mean, hide food for a living, and they recover these stashes or caches of food at a later date, often months later. A classic example is the Clark's nutcracker that lives up in Yosemite and other parts of the United States, and an individual bird is thought to stash about 33,000 seeds, and remember about 90% of them. For someone who struggles to even do the basic spatial memory task of finding my car on a daily basis, this blows me over personally. They also steal other individuals' caches of food, and it's probably this behaviour, namely having to take two different roles of being both a protector of one's own stashes of food and thief of another bird's stashes of food, that might make them so aware of other minds and other times. They have remarkable memories, and one of the discoveries that we made several years ago now is that these birds don't only remember where they've hidden their food, but they remember a lot of other aspects of past caching events. They can remember who was watching when they stashed their food. And they can also remember what kinds of food they've hidden and how long ago, which at the time provided the first evidence that animals might have at least the behavioural components of episodic memory, a memory of past events. We also know that these birds can plan ahead, knowing where to cache food for tomorrow's breakfast, for example, and also knowing what to cache for what they will want when they come back in the future to recover their caches, as opposed to being driven by what they fancy now. Again, that's something that impressed me, having seen my husband go shopping when hungry and seeing all the rubbish and chocolate bars that suddenly appeared in the cupboard out of nowhere. Perhaps the most striking finding that we discovered on the crows, however, is that actually, when it comes to protecting their caches of food, if other individuals are watching when they cache, some of them come back later and move their caches to new hiding places. It's not something that they do if they hide the food in private. They've no need to. Their caches aren't under threat if they've hidden in private. And it's not something they do if their mate is watching. No need to, because they share their food with their mate. But if it's a competitor, particularly a dominant competitor who might steal their food, they move it to new hiding places that by definition, those potential thieves don't know the new location of. I said some of those birds for a reason, because it turns out that it's only those birds who themselves have been thieves in the past that are able to do this. Birds who haven't had a thieving experience aren't able to do it. So it's not a hardwired tendency, and it's not something that they've been rewarded or punished for doing. So the idea is that they're making some kind of theory of mind, like inference, experience projection, of putting themselves in another's shoes to do it. But it's not all about trickery and competition either. They can also be highly cooperative, particularly in the breeding season when it comes to courtship feeding. Like humans, they're highly monogamous, and they usually pair for life. Now, it turns out that the male jays, for example, are very good at knowing what their females want, even when it's something quite different from what they want themselves. They could teach my husband a trick or two. And with that, I'll finish. Thank you.
Vittorio, Gallese.
I'd like to start by making explicit how happy and privileged I feel being part of this really challenging and very exciting project. Human beings are very curious creatures. Since ever, we kept asking a variety of questions. In a way, most of these questions can be reduced to just one question: who we are. What does it mean to be human? In contemporary time, this question turned out to be a dangerous one. It can lead you to a variety of diseases. One disease is called neuromania or neurohubris, which means you're about to tell us who we are just by recording a bunch of neurons in your brain. Is that what you're up to? Another pretty common disease nowadays is called neurophobia, which means we're never going to learn anything about who we are by scanning the brain. So I think the Human Mind Project has the possibility to cure both diseases by integrating a variety of perspectives. I've been always asked myself, how can it be possible to understand how the brain works by asking questions to a bunch of neurons? This is what I've been doing during the first 20 years of my career. If you're lucky, doing a neurophysiological experiment, you are able to correlate a given behavior, sensory motor behavior, cognitive behavior, with the recordings of, say, 100, 200 neurons at best. Or let's exaggerate, maybe 500. If you compare these small figures with the real figures, the billions of neurons that make a human brain or even a macaque brain, this enterprise seemed desperate. However, if you compare a different level of description of the very same brain, someone that is discovered at the single neuron level, take, for example, simple and complex cell discovered by Hubel and Wiesel in the visual cortex, then you go up to another level of description. You use brain scanning, fMRI. So you are not seeing the activity of single neuron. You see the activity of millions of neurons at once. Still, you can recognize ocular dominance columns. Perhaps this is telling us something. So the complexity of the brain is not linearly correlated with the numbers the very same brain expresses. A second interesting point is that the brain is not a brain in a vat. I never thought of the brain like that, perhaps because I'm an MD, I'm a neurologist, so I tend to see the brain always wired to a body, and the body is in turn a sort of interface with the world, so there is also a wet part of the story that must be taken into account. This body, as a further feature, is situated. It happens to be situated in a specific physical world which obeys to physical laws. So this has very dramatic consequence of what the brain-body system can accomplish. And here we come to the main scope of this project, which is to try to answer this basic question by pulling together a variety of level of description, a variety of languages, a variety of approaches. I must say that I feel at home. In 1998, I was giving a talk in Tucson, Arizona, and I don't remember if it was exactly in the talk or during discussion. I made the following statement. You may impute that to the hot Arizona sun, perhaps. But the statement was, well, after all, cognitive neuroscience is part of the humanities. And at coffee break, a colleague of mine said, that doesn't work. I mean, such a statement can do serious harm to your career. And I think he was right. I mean, for a cognitive neuroscientist, being called a philosopher is not exactly a compliment. And I think this is incredibly wrong. I mean, the philosopher is the philosopher, and the cognitive neuroscientist has his own specificity. We have our own technicalities. We are scientific in different ways, but in a way or the other, we are dealing with the same explanandum. You quoted Shakespeare. If you allow me, I'll quote Dante, because I'm Italian. I want to bring you to paradise just for a moment. In the how do you say in English? Canto. In the ninth canto, Dante is addressing the holy soul of a French guy, a former French guy, Folco da Marsiglia, from Marseille. And he makes this statement, I wouldn't need to ask you explicitly about this specific question. S'io m'intuasti come tutti in me, più non attenderei io tua domanda s'io m'intuassi come tutti in me. Which means I would not need to ask you explicitly a question, being a human being, if I were like you, a holy soul, and as a holy soul, you have the capacity to enter into my phenomenal experiential world. This is precluded. I think we shed some light on this aspect. So what Dante wrote about holy spirits can perhaps be brought back on earth. This characterizes one aspect of our relational nature, and possibly this is something that is captured by mirror neurons that you were mentioning. Cognitive neuroscience is in the headlines almost every day. Most of the time, the narrative is very poor. People are looking for hypes. Most people don't even dare to fully write a scientific paper. They just read the abstract and badly report on that. So that's also part of how cognitive neuroscience is misrepresented. Partly is our fault, I'm fully aware of that. But anyway, we are producing a huge amount of data, but with very little theory. So we really need to build theory. We need to be daring. We need to try to see to which extent the manifold, which is what it means to be human, whether adding a new perspective can shed light and trigger a virtuous cycle, which can lead us back to the starting point, the personal level point of asking question, and some of these questions can perhaps be formulated in a different way. So I trust that we are going to achieve very much with this project. Thank you.
Just before we throw it open for the discussion, can I have Chairman's privilege and ask one question? Biology largely works on the assumption of continuity of mechanisms. Evolution is very clever at discovering ways of solving problems, and then it clings onto them through inheritance. So in a sense, the title of this session, What's Special About the Human Mind, is almost heretical in biological terms, because it implies that there might be something absolutely distinct in human beings with no precedent in other species. One thing that's been referred to which might be like that in some respects is, of course, is language, at least language of the form that we use, and there seemed to be some agreement about that amongst the panel. I'm very surprised, particularly with your new interest in the last few years in aesthetics, that you and nobody else said anything about art.
Well, this is a very delicate issue. Why cognitive neuroscience should dare to address these topics? As we were discussing early on this afternoon, I take cognitive neuroscience to be basically a methodological approach. So the fancy machine, the toys, expensive toys we are using do not, in the first place, ground necessarily the type of question we might be asking to the brain-body system. So this question depends on what you take to be crucial to be addressed from this specific level of description. So I not only think it is legitimate for cognitive neuroscience to investigate art, creativity, and aesthetics, I think cognitive neuroscience must address these issues. Not just because of the above-mentioned neurohubris and everything can be reduced to a bunch of neurons. Neurons are not creative. Neurons do not think. They don't feel anything. They don't know things. They are not epistemic agents. The individual is. But nevertheless, I mean, to be human means to be speaking language and to be creative. So I think what cognitive neuroscience can do is not explain what art is. I think this is a very challenging enterprise also for aesthetics, because it's basically a socio-cultural construction. So I don't think we'll ever spot the area for art in the brain as such. I think cognitive neuroscience can act as a sort of cognitive archaeology. So we can deconstruct the words we are normally using to describe what characterizes our mental life. And through such deconstruction, we can understand what an aesthetic experience is made of, for example. This is what I'm up to in the field of visual arts and more recently in the domain of film. I think this is, as I said, not only fully legitimate, but we should investigate these things if one shed light on what does it mean to be you.
But are there precedents? Nikki, do you think that bower birds decorating their bowers are doing art?
I was wondering about that as you were asking the question, really. I think it depends what your definition of art is. So I think for me, I would say that we might find the decorations that bowerbirds do beautiful, and I might actually want to make parallels between contemporary dance and what the bowerbirds do in terms of the way in which they position the objects to heighten the display movements of the males. But I think for me, I would say that it's not necessarily art, because for me, art is about using the imagination system in a more complex way than I talked about with animals, in order to express ideas through creative practices that probably could only be done through language.
What do you think, Deidre, about art?
I think probably art involves a meeting of minds at the least, and on the whole with bowerbirds, guess you don't get a meeting of minds. So I would agree with Nikki that there's something that is aesthetically pleasing to us that may be pleasing to other bowerbirds, but there's no soul-to-soul communication going on, and I think that that's one of the starting points for art.
That's interesting. That's an assumption, of course, but we don't know about mental lives of bowerbirds. Robert, do you want to comment, or shall I throw it open?
I would simply say I think that a lot of even art in some sense, I mean, I'm just hazarding a guess here because I haven't really thought that much about art as such, but in a sense it's about the stories that you read into that the art triggers in your mind that becomes important, and that's where, you know, once you start telling stories in your mind, you're into these very high orders of intentionality. And a lot of art seems, I use that term very generally, you know, everything from poetry upwards and downwards, if you like, and dance, very much clearly, is about storytelling in some form. But it's storytelling which provides community bonding, because you share these kind of icons, and your ability to understand how somebody else is seeing the same performance or the same piece of artwork in the same way, and you can have a kind of discussion about it. That seems to me the critical part in many ways. It's a community project.
Okay. Yes, Paul.
I wanted to suggest a distinction that it might be useful to have in mind when we think about art and whether art is distinctive of humans, whether it's common to other animals. One of them is the question whether producing art is a distinctively human activity. The other is whether having aesthetic experiences is a distinctively human capacity. And there are different things, of course, and you might think the notion of an art object is somehow an extremely social one. It has to do with institutions and practices of appreciation and so forth. But of course, you can appreciate a landscape. I think a landscape is beautiful. That's not in any immediate sense something produced by anyone, but nevertheless think of it as beautiful or experience it as beautiful. So I would say that the more fundamental question is, first, what is an aesthetic response to something? That's a question that philosophers can be quite helpful with. And then the question is, are those kinds of experiences or responses something distinctively human as opposed to something that's shared? The other question I had, or just observation, was nobody mentioned critical reasoning as something that is distinctively human. So I guess there has been some suggestion that second-order thought may not be, though that itself is a more fundamental question. Is the capacity, thought may be common between various species, but first of all, is second-order thought something that other animals are capable of? And if they are, one thing that doesn't seem that they are capable of is something that humans do and do very importantly, which is reflect on the principles that they're using in arriving at conclusions and evaluate whether those principles are correct. So that's the second.
Celia Hayes, I'm a psychologist from Oxford. One kind of answer, the kind of answer I favour to the question of what's special about humans, is the extent to which our minds are not just stocked, but reconfigured by our socio-cultural experience in the course of our development. And one way to get at the extent to which people believe that that's the case is to ask the question, what's the difference between a newborn human and a newborn chimp? And some people are going to say there's massive mental machinery present, or the potential for that machinery in the human infant, which is absent in the chimpanzee. Some are going to say there's just little differences between the two, but they get massively amplified by what happens in the course of development. So I would be interested in at least one-line answers from the panel about what's the difference between a newborn chimp and a newborn human.
I think this is a very, very crucial point. I think this particular point helps to explain why we are so different in spite of the little genomic differences that separate us from, for example, apes. And I think the neotenic dimension of the human baby is probably what makes a substantial difference, which means that our brain, which is overall much bigger than our body mass would predict, grows in a very crucial period after birth when we are totally depending on the cures of the adult caregivers. So that specific organ of ours continues to develop in the relation and because of the relation, of the social relations that we entertain with a member of our group, and particularly with our adult caregivers. So that, I think, introduces an enormous difference with respect to the baby chimp, who is a lot more grown up, so to speak, and requires a much shorter period in which being a primate is also depending on the adult's care. So I think that could explain in principle a lot.
The facetious answer to that, Celia, is human babies don't get to the same developmental stage as chimpanzees at birth until human babies are 1 year old. So you're dealing with a fetus for the first year of life. The slightly panicking observation, of course, the consequence of that is we should have a 21-month gestation. Yes. You may wish to withdraw immediately from any prospect of giving birth to a 1-year-old. But I think at the end of the day, I will simply say that what we find in adult humans is that the mentalizing competences, that's the levels of intentionality they can cope with, is actually correlated basically with the size of key bits of the forebrain, not the whole of the forebrain, frontal lobe here. And that being the case, this is kind of explains why there are species differences across the primates, insofar as we have any data on this at all, on mentalizing competences. And it looks like it's just a linear consequence of the size of essentially the prefrontal cortex.
I wanted to throw into the range of candidates of what's so special about human minds the capacity for self-knowledge. So we can talk about a meeting of minds, we can talk about minds shaping or affecting one another, but there may be a big divide, a fundamental juncture between creatures who have minds and creatures who know they have minds. And in some sense, I think that's a distinctive human capacity. And then the question is, well, if language is very distinctive, and if the capacity for self-knowledge or self-reflection is distinctive, what's the relationship between the two of these? Now, I think it's very easy, probably following what Deirdre said and what Robin said, to think, well, once we have this Gricean mechanism for having thought about thought and thought about others' thoughts, we can somehow get to language. But I'm wondering whether, and I wonder whether this is maybe more appealing to Deirdre, whether language isn't one of the things that provides the bridge between being minded, having representations of the world, and having representations of our representations. Because it's uniquely able to do that in that you can embed representations, sentences, which can either describe the way the world is or describe the way somebody's thinking about how the world is. So I'm wondering whether these two capacities might be connected, and I'm wondering whether you think, especially Deirdre, that that's a priority relation between the two. I
think precisely because language is so fragmentary, vague, ambiguous, and incomplete in the meanings it encodes, there would be absolutely no point in there being a language, in having a language, unless one were already engaged very deeply in the sort of overt, higher order communication that takes place non-verbally in humans, though not, as far as I know, in other species. So I think the order of acquisition has to be first this glycine mechanism of overt communication without language, and then language evolving, as it were, piecemeal as extra clues to the speaker's intention. So I don't actually see it as being a possible bridge to self-knowledge. I think to the extent that we have self-knowledge, and I actually am more interested in the knowledge, the reflective knowledge we have of others or of our relations with others, I don't think it comes via language. I think it has to be already there.
I just wanted to say, though, that I think there's another problem, which is that whilst most animals other than humans probably don't have these other abilities, the biggest problem is how on earth would we ever know? So language may not be what's required for self-reflection, but it's certainly a great way of us being able to assess whether others have it. And without that, it's not clear how you would develop those phenomenological consciousness tests.
Can I just pick up on one thing that Paul raised, namely the question of normativity? Now, so, should. Now, this touches on morality, ethics, which, by the way, are not the same thing at all, and by ethics, on indeed something that Vittorio raised, namely existential issues, which are highly associated with phenomenology. But so one might say, oh, well, all you need is a second-order representation or a third-order representation for that. But it's not clear to me that that gives you the essential verb mood or mode of should, or any of the normativities, and actually in different societies, even certain kinds of rule followings that are not necessarily seen by them as moral, there are sanctions for violations of those rules which are not necessarily seen as that way. And so I just wondered if that will be something that the project will deal with, because it seems to me it's always puzzling to me. And when certain philosophers like Pat Churchland try to give an account of morality, it's not morality they're giving an account of at all. It's simply the preconditions for it.
It does seem that the best predictors of high levels of competence, mentalizing competence, are actually language competence. So your ability to, what language seems to be doing in that context, is allowing you to frame and keep the bits in mind in terms of handling different levels of mind states in different individuals. And that's probably kind of, really important to the whole process. It's not the same as language. Language is just giving you a framework to work with.
I can say, Tony, that this is a key issue. Last night over dinner we were discussing about another issue that is obsessing me. I mean, if you move from, let's say, from a bodily cognition or embodied cognition perspective on mind, language in itself is a big challenge, but particularly counterfactuals, negation, questions. So negation might have a lot to say about normativity, perhaps. And one way to go would be to fully explore inhibition in the brain, which, yeah, you look puzzled. I am puzzled too.
But I can see that as an implementation, but not as an explanation.
Well, finding an implementation of negation in the brain would make me enormously happy.
The Human Mind Project and our discussion today has been rightly focused on the good things about the human mind. I would say another unique characteristic of human beings is that we are uniquely destructive. Has the human mind been a net benefit or a detriment to Earth?
Well, I think the neotenic nature of human beings might have something to say, in the sense that we probably internalize certain habits and attitude that we bring along even during adulthood. That's one possible way to investigate the point you raised. Another brings us back to normativity, or even earlier to negation. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think we have any evidence that any other living animal is able to negate the status of belonging to the same species to another individual belonging to the same species, while we can say she or he is not a human being, and therefore I am fully legitimate to destroy her or him. So this appears to be uniquely human, and probably is not of one of the worst spin-off of language, probably.
I've heard about art and language and behavior, of course, but very little about morality. And my question is, of course, it's a point which distinguishes us from other animals. And my question is, why morality is not explicitly mentioned in the project? Is there a particular reason for that? Or what do you think about this topic being very spread in all of what you have said about our experience of art, for instance, because we are moved by sentiments which appeared in morality as well, and in language and so far?
Well, I mean, the simple answer is word length. There are dozens of other aspects of human mental experience which could have been on the list. Certainly ethics, morality, the emotions and so on surely will be included. There's no mention of religion. We have to think carefully about how to tackle that, whether as a crucial definer of the human mind or whether just a piece of behavior that human beings happen to indulge in. Yeah, I think we have to make this the last question.
Since we mentioned other species, art and aesthetics, I'd like to ask, first of all, doesn't aesthetics starts with the sense of taste? And if this is true, will it really be universal across many species? And the other thing concerning art, is there a clear boundary between art and play? And in that sense, could we extend that to other species as well?
Other animals certainly play. The extent to which you want to argue that play is art, I think, is a tricky one. I've always thought of art being first and foremost about ideas, and therefore that playing with ideas is art. It's not clear to me that things like rough and tumble play, or a raven sliding down its back on a slope, is what I would think of as art. So it probably depends on what your definitions of play and art are and how you see them together. But for me specifically, it's that form of play that's related to playing with ideas and trying to get the meeting of minds about how to play with those ideas that would be art, and therefore I don't have any evidence that other animals do. They might do, I just don't know how to assess it.
Well, we've gone over time, but I hope you think it was worthwhile. I'm all that stands between you and the drink, so I'll be brief. Thank you very much for coming. I hope you got a sense of, even with this remarkable range of expertise, a sense of the scale of this project, the intellectual scale of the project, and we're all looking forward to it. It'll be exciting. Our thanks then to our four contributors, to Deidre Wilson and Robin Dunbar, Nicky Clayton, and Vittorio Gallese. Thank you.
This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.